Good afternoon, have your seat. It's so nice to say have your seat because it has been really a long while since we were not sitting in this room. So it's really nice to be back, and nice to be back with so many nice people here in the room and here on stage. And also I greet the colleagues that are online. I know quite a few are online in the Parliament and beyond the Parliament. My name is Etienne Bassot. I'm the Director of the Members Research Service and also currently Acting Director General. So the library, first, the library is open to authors. It's a place for discussion, it's a place for exchange, it's a place for meeting, and it's a place for discussing the books about the European Union, but also beyond. And today we are particularly privileged to welcome Jeff Nussbaum. Jeff has written this book, Undelivered, the never-heard speeches that would have rewritten history. And Jeff has been speechwriter for more than 2 decades of Vice President Al Gore, then Vice President Biden, and now, until recently, President Biden. And he led also and co-led speechwriting in at least in the last 4 Democratic Conventions. So, today is a bit of a special week because one is thinking a lot about transatlantic relations. We welcomed in the EPRS yesterday high-level delegations from the Senate, the Chamber and the Senate, and we have in 2 days also an online policy roundtable on the midterm elections. And as you know, these midterm elections are in 2 weeks now. But today, we're not going to talk about transatlantic relations, and for those who are going to take part in the debate, please don't do so. Jeff is not here to say who is going to win the next elections or to comment on politics. He's here to talk about his book. So, and this presentation today is part of a series. I'd just like to recall that we had such books on public speaking twice. We had one in 2019 with Eric Schnur, that was the political speechwriter's companion. And we had also in 2020 with Viv Groskop, How to Own the Room, and that was at the time also How to Own the Screen, Women and the Art of Brilliant Speaking. And today's event focuses on speeches, speechwriting, skills, and history. So, I will invite Jeff to say a few words to present his book. I like also, before doing so, to greet the colleagues in the room, but also to greet the colleagues from the other institutions. I recognize faces that are active in speechwriting for our president here, but also in the other institutions. And then the discussion will be led by Isabelle Gaudeul-Ehrhart, who was speechwriter herself for President von der Leyen until recently. And here in the Parliament, she leads the Speaking with Impact community. And she's also, as Jeff is, part of this World Association of Speechwriters. So we are very much looking to this discussion. We have until 3 o'clock for this event. So we have 1.5 hours. So please already think about your questions that come afterwards. But first, over to you, Jeff, and most welcome in the European Parliament.
Thank you all. There's a joke among speechwriters, and it's about the speechwriter who dies and is given a choice between heaven and hell. Being a good researcher, as all speechwriters must be, he first says, "Let me see hell." And there he's shown millions of speechwriters on millions of computers typing away under a deadline. And he says, "This seems hellish. Let me see heaven." And there he's shown millions of speechwriters on millions of computers typing away on a deadline. And he says to St. Peter, "This looks just like hell." And St. Peter says, "Oh no, up here we use what they write." So we're going to talk a little bit about undelivered speeches, and we're going to talk a little bit about how some of these speeches, what they can teach us about communication and persuasion and leadership. And we're going to talk a little bit about how many of these are not simply American approaches to communication, but how certain types of communication can engender a universal human response. Isabelle will then ask me some questions, and then I'll take any questions you have. And I never want to correct Etienne, but I am happy to answer some American political questions. I just can't guarantee that my answers will be accurate. So But before I do all of that, I do want to thank Etienne Bessot for the introduction and for starting this very program that brings me here. Michela Del Monte, who we miss terribly in the United States, Isabelle Gaudeul-Ehrhart, who was going to interview me, and everyone who's making this event possible. Now, by the way, the reason I began with a joke is that speakers have a very limited amount of time to capture the attention of an audience. By some measures, it's 8 to 11 seconds if you're on a screen. It's a little longer if you're in person. And yet, what does every speaker begin with? Thank you, thank you, thank you. And you lose the audience in that little bit of time you have to capture their attention. So I wrote in this book that the most gripping speeches do not start with the acknowledgments, and I've tried today to follow my own advice. So anyone who writes speeches for a living has lots of speeches that go undelivered for one reason or another. President Biden was supposed to give a speech about vehicle electrification, electric school buses, that got canceled when the verdict in the trial of the police officer who killed George Floyd was announced. And I have to say, I wrote a very good speech about electric buses, but I didn't write this book to salvage electric bus speeches from history's scrap heap. The obsession began on election night in 2000. My first job out of university was writing speeches for Al Gore. And I believe we have a photo of a much younger me with much more hair. Do we have that up on the, can we put that up on the screens? Is that up? All right, oh, there we go, there's me, yeah. So, so what I'm holding in my hand, my first speech was about clean drinking water. We were installing drinking water filtration systems in rural America. And hearing about this, I decided I would write the speech around Al Gore dramatically holding up this prop, dramatically holding up that bottle of water. So I wrote to the Department of Agriculture, which was responsible for the program, and I said, can we bring a bottle of water to the speech? And I write the speech around the bottle of water, and the day of the speech arrives, and they show up, and there's no water. And I run out to the security gate, because they say they've stopped the water at the security gate. And I run out to the security gate, and sure enough, there's the Secret Service sort of warily looking at this jar of water. And I say, that's water, and I need it for the vice president's speech. And they said, well, clearly this is not water. Look at it. It looks like mud. It looks terrible. And I said, no, it's water. And to prove it to you, and I grabbed it, and as I raised it to my lips, they said, okay, if you're willing to drink it, you can bring it into the White House. And so that's how I got both a lesson in how not persuasive my speeches were, but also the power of props, because when Al Gore spoke, a lot of times when he was vice president, the media wouldn't pay a ton of attention. But he held up the water, and all of a sudden you hear click, 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 and they start paying attention. So as important as the words are, the visuals are important very much as well. I know we have a visual artist here, so yeah. But Al Gore was also the beginning of this book, because on election night 2000, there were 3 speeches Al Gore did not deliver. He had a victory speech, he had a concession speech, and then strangely enough, we thought Al Gore might win the Electoral College, but lose the popular vote. So there was a version where he was explaining the difference, explaining that an Electoral College win in America is still a win, something Americans didn't know all that well at the time. They know it very well now. But when he gave none of those speech, I began to think, where are the other moments in history, not just political history, but issues of war and peace and pop culture, where one outcome was so possible that there was a draft prepared that shows us the beginnings of what a journey down that road looked like. So I recreated these dramatic moments of choosing and consequence and circumstance where, again, one outcome was so possible that there's a draft of it. If the United States had launched 800 airstrikes as planned on Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis against what we now know were already armed Soviet nuclear missiles, if King Edward had gone directly to the British people and asked to marry Wallis Simpson and held on to the throne, leaving Britain with a Nazi-sympathizing king at the dawn of World War II, if the D-Day invasion of Normandy fails and is repelled by the Germans, and Eisenhower has to account for it and apologize for it, if in 1939 Pope Pius XI speaks out against Mussolini and fascism right before his death. If in Japan, Emperor Hirohito had resigned the throne and thrown himself at the mercy of the War Crimes Tribunal at the end of World War II, if at that famous march on Washington in 1963 in the United States, where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, John Lewis and Martin Luther King gave the speeches they really wanted to give. They had prepared very different speeches, and all America heard was not I Have a Dream, but they had heard John Lewis's Nightmare. If President Nixon refuses to resign and fights impeachment to the end, if the anarchist Emma Goldman uses her trial in New York for inciting a riot to actually incite a riot, all of these things and a lot more could have happened. And not only could they have happened, but there were speeches prepared that set them in motion. And so I'm not a historian and I'm not a journalist, but this project allowed me to be both, to find and excavate this history. And in each chapter, I recreate the events, sometimes less known, sometimes forgotten, and share the speech. And then I offer a little bit about what it says about the process and practice of speech writing. And one of the questions I've been asked several times as I've toured around talking about this book is, are there any speeches in here that I wish had been given? Which do I wish had been given? And this is not intended to be a political talk, but there's a very easy answer for me and those who share my politics, which is that Hillary Clinton gave me her victory speech in 2016. And I would have liked her to have been able to give that speech. Although in the chapter where I share the speech, there's something that's really interesting that happens, which is the speech itself, initially, the early drafts, are not particularly powerful. What you see is all of the cracks that ran through her campaign run right into the victory speech. What are we going to say to the Bernie Sanders supporters on the left? What are we going to say to the Donald Trump supporters who I just called deplorable? What are we going to say to the elite media that, even though I've won, would have expected a bigger win? And so they showed me, she shared with me all these drafts, and they're dealing with all these problems, but they don't have that moment, that powerful moment that brings everything together. And something funny happens in politics when you're working on a campaign that is not doing well. And when it's not doing well, everyone sends you emails with ideas. Everyone says, if they would only say this, it would solve all your problems. If they would only say this. And this is what happened to Hillary's speechwriter. There were lots of emails coming in. But there was one from a poet, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, that he read, and he thought, there's something here. And it combined with something Hillary was thinking about too, which is Hillary Clinton's mother had a really difficult life story. She was abandoned by her grandparents. She was basically almost sold into servitude as a housemaid. She had a very difficult life. She was sent across the country when she was 8 years old, not by herself, with her younger sister, an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, on a train going across the country. And this poet says, can you imagine you having a conversation with your mother as a child? And she writes this beautiful imaginary conversation where an adult Hillary walks down the aisle of the train and sits down next to her 8-year-old mother and says to her, I dream of going up to her and sitting down next to her, taking her in my arms and saying, look at me, listen to me. You have a difficult life now, but you will survive. You will have a good family of your own and 3 children, and as hard as it might be to imagine, your daughter will grow up to be president of the United States. And it's just this beautiful, powerful moment. And it makes me terribly sad that she never got to share it. And by the way, that speech also would have illustrated something else that I think we all struggle with, which is the power of story. And I talk about the power of story a lot because humans like to think that we are thinking creatures who have feelings. But the evidence shows that that's not the case. We are feeling creatures who occasionally think. And there's a wonderful study about this. In 2007, researchers at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in the United States approached students and asked in the library and asked them to take a short survey. They took the survey. They were paid $5, 5 single dollar bills. After that, they were offered a choice. They were they were offered the choice to give some of the money they had just been given to a charity, to save the children, a charity many of us know. Half of them were given a paragraph that talked about starvation in Africa, how many people were desperately poor, statistics on food insecurity. Half of them were given a picture of a little girl, and it simply said, this girl is from Mali, her name is Rokia, and she's desperately poor and faces the threat of severe hunger or even starvation. Very simple. The people who read the letter about the statistics gave on average $1.14. The people who read the letter about the little girl, Rokia, gave more than twice as much, $2.38. So they thought, well, if people who read the statistics gave a little bit, and people who got the emotional story gave a lot, how powerful would it be if we combine the statistics and the emotion? So what do we think happens when they get the statistics and the emotion? Anyone have any thoughts? How much? What's that? Less money, exactly right. They gave less money than had they received the story alone. And the researchers thought, this can't be. This can't be right. So they reran the study. And this time, the survey they asked the students in the library to do, they asked some of them to do a math problem, and they asked some of them to write down the words they think of when they hear the word baby, the word baby. The math group gave $1.26. The baby group gave $2.34. So this is a paradox for us. Just the act of thinking analytically primes us to shut down emotionally. And this is why story is so very powerful in so much of what we do. There's another example of the power of story that I talk about. And this is John F. Kennedy and his last words, and the story he wants to tell about the United States. I'll talk a little more about the last chapter of the book because I talk about speeches that people did not have a chance to give, that they died while they were preparing. But people in the United States, when they hear about this speech, they know some of the lines. Some of the lines are famous. He has this famous ending where he says, "We in this country, in this generation, are by destiny rather than choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth and goodwill towards men. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For as written long ago, except the Lord keepeth the city, the watchman waketh, but in vain." So Kennedy wanted America to serve as the watchman on the wall for world freedom. But a closer reading of the speech and the circumstances in which it was drafted has a really powerful message, not just for the United States, but for all of us today. Because it shows that Kennedy wanted to make clear that the watchman on the wall can't just look outside the wall to see threats to freedom. He must look inside the walls as well. In fact, half of the speech is devoted to what his close advisor, who was named Ted Sorensen, called the fires of rage that burn beneath peace and prosperity. In the United States at the time, these fires of rage revealed themselves in a very vocal right-wing effort to discredit and demonize Kennedy. One of the leaders of this effort was a man named Edwin Walker, who had been a former World War II general who helped start riots in Mississippi when the university there tried to integrate by accepting black students. Walker had also run as a right-wing candidate for governor of Texas. And using language similar to the attacks that President Donald Trump and his supporters would wage on their political opponents a half-century later, he declared that civil rights demonstrations in Washington and Texas were pro-Kennedy, pro-communist, pro-socialist. And as we've seen all too often recently, violent words are often a precursor and a permission structure for violent actions. And so Kennedy was preparing a speech where he was going to say, "Today there are other voices heard in the land, voices preaching doctrines wholly unrelated to reality. And also, ignorance and misinformation can handicap the progress of a city or a company, but they can, if allowed to prevail in foreign policy, handicap the country's security." So Kennedy's hope, as he was prepared to say, we cannot expect that everyone, to use the phrase of a decade ago, will talk sense to the American people. but we can hope that fewer people will listen to nonsense. Leaders play an important role in increasing our awareness of threats and conditioning our responses to them. Would Americans have sat up and paid attention if their president had told them, stop listening to nonsense? If Kennedy had lived and secured a second term, he was very popular at the time, would he have made combating domestic extremism a priority, articulating the threat from within as clearly as he articulated the threat from Russia in his first campaign? Of course, we cannot know, but what we do know is that Kennedy wanted an America with fewer people listening to and falling prey to nonsense. So as I said, that speech appears in my final chapter, and I call this chapter Last Words because it includes 4 speeches that speakers were busy preparing when they died. There's the Kennedy speech I just mentioned, and it feels very relevant to our international moment about the rise of right-wing anger. And there's Pope Pius XI in 1939, who wanted to disavow fascism. I have President Franklin Roosevelt, who died as he was preparing a speech that intended to look past the end of World War II. He wanted to talk not just about an end to war, but an end to the beginnings of wars. And then I have Albert Einstein, who was preparing to speak at Israel Independence Day. And I found it very striking that all of those speeches across continents and years had a common theme, and it's a theme that lies at the heart of the European project: peace. How do we achieve peace? How can we live in peace? And so throughout this book, writing this book, I learned a great deal, including lessons about leadership and the power of leadership. And one of them that really sticks with me, this is an image of the speech General Eisenhower, who became President Eisenhower, intended to give, as I mentioned, if the D-Day invasion had failed. And one of the things you see in this speech is, it's hard to read his handwriting. He wrote it in haste. He misdated it, July 5th, not June 5th. But he writes, the troops have been withdrawn. And then he crosses it out and writes, I have decided to withdraw the troops. And at the very bottom, he says, the decision is mine alone, and he underlines mine alone. So in English, for those of us who remember our grammar, the troops have been withdrawn is passive voice. I have withdrawn the troops is active voice. And it's a wonderful example that the language of leadership is that leaders take responsibility. And now certainly Europe's history and world history would be very different if Eisenhower had to give that speech. But one of the things that I find troubling in this moment is there's now some evidence done by social scientists that here Eisenhower was prepared to apologize. He gave an interview many years later, and he said, what was going to happen if the invasion had failed? I had planned it, I had timed it, I made the decision to go, I had executed it. It was my responsibility. And if it failed, that would be on my shoulders. And today, and by the way, this was an interesting tool of leadership Eisenhower used. Before any engagement in battle that he ordered, he wrote an apology for its failure. He made himself imagine what failure looked like and apologize for it to convince himself that the risks were worth it. And I just think it's a wonderful tool of leadership. But there's some evidence now, at least in the US, that you should never apologize, that a leader should never apologize. And the evidence shows that if you apologize, you demoralize your supporters and you embolden your detractors. Your supporters say, gosh, I supported them, but they screwed up. And your opponents say, see, we told you they were awful all along. And this is a real problem in our politics, which is morality and just leadership tells us you take responsibility. But what we're seeing increasingly is that people who deny and obfuscate and make things up, they actually survive. And so I don't have an answer, but I'll present the problem and hope to enlist your help in solving it. So certainly European history would have been very different if the D-Day invasion failed. It would have also been very different if in England, King Edward had not abdicated. And in fact, King Edward VIII, that is, did not want to abdicate. He wanted to marry Wallis Simpson. And this was one of the chapters I had some fun writing because history still isn't entirely clear. But we know that King Edward, for a while at least, wanted to stay on the throne, and he wanted to appeal directly to the British people, and he prepared a speech in secret that he intended to deliver. Now, the mystery is how many of Winston Churchill's fingerprints were on the speech. Because Winston Churchill at that time was out of power and was thinking, perhaps if the king refuses to abdicate, it divides the parliament into a king's party and an anti-king's party. And Winston Churchill's wife once described him as the last believer in the world of the divine right of monarchs. So Churchill, interestingly, was a big fan of the king when very few other people were, but he thought, if I could divide the parliament, I can lead the king's party and I can ride the king's party back to power. Now, the irony, of course, is had the king remained on the throne, it would have been a very, very sticky situation during World War II, when Winston Churchill, now as prime minister, actually had to exile him to the Caribbean because they were worried that he was literally undermining the British war effort, that he was secretly communicating with the Nazis, telling them to keep bombing London. I mean, it's really horrible stuff. So again, history really rests on a razor's edge, And a while ago, someone asked me, well, what is the thesis of the book? What is the overall thesis of the book? And it's articulated in a quote that I found from President Grant, who was a US president in the late 1800s. And I share it in the chapter about the Eisenhower speech. Grant said, I am a verb. I'm a verb. And the point is, leaders are action takers. So many of you here occupy positions of leadership and influence and support other people who occupy positions of leadership and influence. And as I just said, outcomes often rest on a razor's edge. And we all have the power to nudge things. And so that's really the thesis, to use the positions you have to make the difference you can, because that in turn can make a difference for a community or a country or a continent or the world. And with that, we'll have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for sharing on your book. And I think it raises also our appetite for those who haven't done so yet to read it. I just wanted to say that we have 3 books in the library, so now you have probably to queue because I'm sure they are out, but here we are. It exists also as an e-book. Just an anecdote, when you were talking, it reminded me of something. You know, in the parliament, of course, elections are something important and something everybody's watching. And when we talk about European election, there was a tendency of slight decline of participation. And we as a research service, we always try to find explanations, you know, about the sociology of the electorate, about the lack of trust in public institutions, and so on. And we had elaborated on that. And the good story is that last time we didn't need to deliver because the curve was rising again in the last election. So that's actually a good story of an undelivered speaking point. Thank you. So I hand over to you, Isabelle, for making comments on the book and then putting a couple of questions.
Thank you very much, Etienne. Jeff, I think I will start where you finished. We all have the power to nudge things. That's the thesis. You have to make the difference you can, because that can make a difference for a community, a country, a continent. So for us here today, for a community, it is the difference we can make for our colleagues. For a country, for our institution. I see colleagues, speechwriters from different institutions, so I know it resonates beyond the European Parliament. And for a continent, of course, for the European Union. This is where we work, this is the project we work for. Thank you for reminding us that we can make this difference. Whether we are members of the European Parliament, assistants, member of staff, managers, speakers, speechwriters, we can make a difference, and we should make a difference with the words we use. Speakers, speechwriters, friends of powerful words gathered here today in the room and online. I know many are watching online indeed. After listening to Jeff, you have understood. If you like history, if you like informed, well-researched history, and we very much like this standard of knowledge here in the European Parliament Research Service. Independent, objective, authoritative is our motto. Empowering through knowledge is our mission. So we very much like this high standard of information, of knowledge. So if you like history of that level, you will love the book. If you like a book, it's a speechwriter speaking. This is well written. Very well, extremely well written. both the overall architecture of the book and literally every sentence. If you like this level, you will love the book. And if you like humor, you will often smile, because this is another talent of Jeff. So many reasons to enjoy the book, but this is not why we are having this book talk today. We are having this book talk today because 1 year ago, you made a presentation of the book at the World Conference of the Professional Speechwriters Association. And when you spoke about the language of leadership, about how to construct a speech, about the elements for a persuasive speech, and I was listening, I thought, wow, this would be super relevant for us in the European Parliament, especially a few months before we start the year before the elections. So I thought it would be very useful if we could have you coming to the European Parliament. You will later, colleagues and friends in the room, have the opportunity to ask questions to Jeff, but before, I will focus a few comments and questions on really the art and craft of speechwriting. So the book focuses on a series of speeches, the history behind, and uses each speech, there are 15 chapters, and each speech, you mentioned a few already, to shine a spotlight on the work of the speechwriter, whether it is persuasive speech, the language of leadership you've just mentioned, the power of story you mentioned as well. I would like to focus on a few others. So I will have a few questions on the profession of speechwriter, then some rhetoric tools that you haven't addressed yet, and that what speeches can achieve. So first, the speechwriter job. I would like to stop a little bit on this because this is a profession that is often not well known. And by definition, speechwriters, we are backstage. We are supposed to be heard, not seen. So it's often not well known. Jeff, how would you define your work? In the book, in the chapter on the President Nixon's undelivered refusal to resign, you speak about a Faustian bargain. That's on page 73. Can you explain this, please?
Sure. One of the things, I was very lucky to be very young and working in the White House. I was 21 years old. I was working for Al Gore. It was so exciting. And of course, I wanted to tell everyone what I was doing. I wanted to tell everyone what I saw. I wanted to tell everyone what it was like to be inside the room, you know, the room where it happens. And I realized very early on, well, that's the bargain you make as a speechwriter, which is you're going to get to see things that not everyone gets to see. You're going to get to hear things not everyone gets to hear. You're often going to get to have conversations with your boss. I mean, conversations I had with President Biden, conversations I've had in my private sector life with celebrities and athletes and actors. But you don't get to share what you see beyond what the person you're working for wants to share. So I said, what a difficult deal for a 21-year-old to make. We're going to show you all of this, and you can tell people none of it. And so, so even when I started writing this book, some friends asked me, you know, well, how do you find your own voice after 2 decades of writing for other people? And indeed, there were whole pages that I would throw out because I sounded like Al Gore, you know, or I sounded like Joe Biden. I didn't sound like me, so I had to remember what it was like to sound like me. But one of the things people often say now is, does everyone have a speechwriter? And is that really them? Is that authentic? That doesn't seem right. Something about it seems off. And one of the ways I've approached the job is not to be a total political philosopher about it, but I do believe in you know, philosopher John Locke said, to own something, you have to mix your labor with it. And so the way I've approached speechwriting is the speeches belong to the speaker, but a good speech is one that they have to mix their labor with. It shouldn't be me trying to fill up the empty vessel. It should be me helping them be their best self. But that was the difficult deal, is you're going to see all of this, but you can't share all of it. And that's why I wrote a history book and not a tell-all.
Okay, thank you very much for this. In the chapter on the undelivered speech by King Edward, you mentioned the relationship between the person who holds the pen and the speaker. And in the chapter on Nixon, you mentioned working for someone you would disagree with, at least on some speeches.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about this dimension of the profession?
Yeah, a couple of these speeches are deeply, deeply personal for the speaker, right? For King Edward to talk about his undelivered speech, he basically says, I have a lot of privileges as your king, but I'm denied the one thing none of you are denied, which is a loving partnership. And it was almost sort of pathetic. He was basically like, don't you want your king to be happy? Like, shouldn't your king have a chance to have a wife? And so, and if you imagine the speechwriter sitting there asking the speaker, you know, how do you want to discuss this? These conversations are almost personal. And sometimes when I'm doing my job, I joke that one of us should be lying on a couch, you know, and we should be billing for therapy, not just speech writing, because it is this interesting thing where you get to these moments where speakers ultimately want to share something personal. And I talk about Nixon's non-resignation speech, and one of the things we forget about Nixon, to the extent people know Richard Nixon in America and in the world, he's kind of thought of as like a dark, shadowy figure. He always has a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. He looks kind of evil. But he was very persuasive. He was very charming. And early on in his career, he gave a very famous speech. He was in trouble. He was in danger of being kicked off the vice presidential ticket for President Eisenhower because of a campaign finance irregularity. And he gave a very famous speech, which is called in America the Checkers speech, where he basically described all of his finances. This is how much money I made. This is how much money I earned. These are the gifts I've received. And he said, but there's one gift I received that we're not giving back. And it's a little dog named Checkers. So a fundraiser gave him a dog. He said, the children love the dog. We're keeping the dog. And commentators thought this speech was terrible. They called it a financial striptease. In other words, he stripped his finances naked and laid them bare for the world to see, and it was considered very undignified. But it was the beginning of a new type of political communication that was deeply personal and that relied a little bit on grievance. And so even though the commentators thought it was terrible, Americans loved it. They wrote hundreds of thousands of letters to the Republican National Committee. Even though Nixon, when he got off stage, was very frustrated because he forgot to give the address, but they figured it out. They wrote letters saying, you have to keep Nixon on the ticket. You have to keep him as vice president. And so this began this type of personal communication. And it put speechwriters in a very interesting, delicate position because you're asking someone who is your boss to share something of themselves personally. But this goes back also to the question of why authenticity matters so much, is because increasingly we want our leaders to share with us a little bit about themselves. We want them to feel more relatable.
Thank you for this. I could continue for long on questions focusing on the profession of speechwriter, but I suggest I move to my second part, because speechwriters, we know that the length of the speech and respecting timing matters. So let's move to the second part, focusing on a few rhetorical tools. So you already mentioned while speaking the importance of a prop, showing us
sometimes,
the bottle.
not all the time, sometimes, but yes.
Sometimes, yeah. But sometimes it can help the message to remain much more memorable.
Yes.
You mentioned the power of stories. You mentioned something as simple as the passive voice for leadership. Let's focus on some other aspects. In the chapter on John Lewis' speech and Too Hot, Undelivered speech, you address fact-checking and message-checking. And especially here in the research service, we care very much for reliable information. Can you tell us more about fact-checking and the research service in the White House process of speechwriting, how it's organized, how it works?
Yes, absolutely. The chapter, I mentioned it only very briefly here, but I have a chapter. The first chapter is about John Lewis and Martin Luther King, two civil rights leaders who wanted to deliver much stronger speeches at the March on Washington. And one of the reasons I begin that chapter is one of my jobs has been to oversee speech writing at several Democratic national conventions. And these are the 4-day conventions where, 190, 200 speakers. And I joke that my job is basically to get yelled at by 190 different speakers because I want more time. I want to speak in prime time. But one of the things that chapter illustrates is that, and I think you see it a lot in party politics, and you may see it a pretty fair amount here in Parliament, is even though groups of people are often on the same page, believe the same things, want the same goals, they also have their own individual brands. And so that's one of the things these conventions illustrate is this tension between being aligned on a larger goal, but still wanting to share your individual brand, your individual truth. And that's one of the things both King and Lewis wrestled with. But you've asked about the fact-checking and the research aspect of it. So one of the famous quotes in speech writing is people say, when Pericles speaks, this is a quote, or as we learn, an apocryphal quote, when Pericles speaks, the people say how well he speaks. When Demosthenes speaks, the people say, let us march. And it's a wonderful quote for two reasons. One is it's a powerful lesson that the goal of a speech is to get people to march. It's to move an audience to action or allegiance. The second lesson, as I talk in the book, is the quote is totally apocryphal. It never existed. Pericles and Demosthenes were born, 70 or 80 years, one was born 80 years after the other died. They never heard each other. So it's a wonderful example to also check your sources. But one of the things while I was leading the Democratic convention, the Republican convention that year had taken place a little bit earlier. And Melania Trump gave a speech that was completely plagiarized from Michelle Obama, mostly plagiarized. And so this is why we use fact checkers. We actually use plagiarism checking software because even a small accident in today's social media age can blow up your entire message. Once an accident, a mistake goes viral, it can change everything. So in the White House, there's a research office. Certainly when I worked in Congress, in the U.S. Congress, we used the Congressional Research Service. But in the White House, in addition to the policy offices who give you the policy expertise, we used our research office to fact check every speech. And we use our counsel's office to have the lawyers look at every speech. So every speech got 2 reviews to make sure that it is factual and defensible, and you didn't didn't say anything that got anyone in trouble. And so sometimes I have a client who used to say, a speech is theater, not disclosure, right? A speech is a performance, not a legal brief. So shouldn't there be a little room to fudge the facts a little and have the performance? Well, in the White House, we decided, no, there is no room to fudge the facts because you never want to weaken your argument by giving someone a chance to undercut it.
Thank you very much for highlighting this, especially with the link with the research service. In the same chapter, you also mention rehearsing. And this is something we have very much developed in the Speaking with Impact community of practice, how we can help each other rehearse with one another, help get feedback. Yet I still hear people who say, I prefer not to rehearse. I want to come across as natural, spontaneous. What would you say to someone who says this?
So I'll start that answer by saying I hear this all the time. I'm better when I'm loose. I'm better when I'm off the cuff. I'm better when I just stand up and do my thing and don't practice. That's when people see the real me. And the one thing I often say is actually, and this sounds counterintuitive, you're more authentic when you do rehearse. You are better when you practice. That joke, I've told that joke 1,000 times. Not that you're not special, and there's lots of new material here for you, but you get better at things as you get more comfortable with them. If you are telling a story, you want to have told it before. And so even though it is counterintuitive, I see it almost as a way of honoring your audience. You honor your audience by practicing. You honor your audience by giving a little more thought to what you're going to say. Because yes, some people are more loose when they just talk. They feel more comfortable. But they are often also more likely to ramble on, to talk themselves into a corner, to forget where they are and forget what the point was. And so rehearsal serves one goal of making you more loose and more comfortable. You know, and it serves a second goal, which is it honors the audience. It provides a stronger performance. It helps you connect, and performance really matters. At risk of undercutting anyone who writes for a living, there's a saying we have in the US, which is, people will never remember what you said. They'll remember how you made them feel, right? Which gets back to feelings. And a strong performance, one that you've rehearsed, makes people feel better. And the feeling is sometimes as powerful as the words.
Thank you very much for this. You already mentioned the importance of checking the quotes. I would like to go back to one aspect of it, which is linked with how you prepare and construct a speech. It's in the chapter on Condoleezza Rice's undelivered speech on the President Bush administration's foreign policy, a speech that was supposed to be delivered in the afternoon of 9/11. And of course, events happen, as you say in the chapter, and this speech was not delivered. You research how this speech was being prepared, and how they mentioned at one point Thomas Friedman. I remember reading the chapter, I said, hey, did Thomas Friedman really write this? Can you tell us more about this? It's page 237.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the... Yes. I've memorized a lot of the book. I haven't memorized all of it.
237. So okay. What did they do?
So this is a chapter... So Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State and then National Security Advisor, was prepared to actually speak on September 11, 2001, just by coincidence, on foreign policy. And the speech was about missile defense. And in fact, it had a line. So someone leaked a little bit of the speech to me, but the whole speech still remains classified. It shouldn't be classified, but it is classified. So I don't have the speech in the book, but I was able to, through a Freedom of Information Act request, which is a law we have in the United States where you can get a lot of the information, I was able to get all of the materials that she used in putting together the speech. She was prepared to talk about missile defense. And interestingly, the #1 opponent to the missile defense was a senator by the name of Joe Biden. So at this time, they're spending a lot of time. I saw all the material they used to prepare the speech. They're spending a lot of time trying to say, basically, here's why Joe Biden is wrong. And one of the things, and this gets to the idea of theater versus disclosure, they found an op-ed by Thomas Friedman where he said, the core problem with the Bush approach to missile defense is that it's based on flimsy or dishonest arguments. So that's a pretty searing indictment, right? It's based on bad evidence. It's based on bad ideas. But later in the op-ed, he also says, I'm not theologically against missile defense. It has to be judged by what it really is. A defense system that will always be, at best, a supplement to mutually assured destruction. It's like wearing suspenders along with a belt. Now, I read that and I thought, oh, I see what they're trying to do here. I see what they want to do here, right? Have you ever seen the movie posters with the tiny little quotes that say amazing or excellent, but the longer review says the movie is terrible, right? So like I thought this would be like, right, like a movie review says, I left this movie amazed that such a piece of trash could ever get made, right? And the movie poster says, I left this movie amazed. I thought, well, this is what they're trying to do. I could imagine them saying, even Tom Friedman, who's no great fan of our position, argues that missile defense is like wearing suspenders with a belt. Well, in a dangerous world, we can't risk getting caught with our pants down. So I wrote this chapter as almost a thought experiment, saying, using the materials they had, what speech would they have written? And when you see the materials, it became very clear what they were going to try to do. And by the way, there's a term for this. They were going to write a type of speech using a technique called refutation, right? Refutation is where you line up all of your opponent's arguments and you knock them down one by one.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to start a question on refutation, but I think I'll keep it for later if we want to move forward in the conversation. So with this, answer, thank you. I'm moving to the third part, which is what speeches can achieve, what we can achieve with speeches. So, Jeff, listening to you last year and then reading the book, of course, I started to wonder, what are the undelivered speeches of the European history, of our European project? And I thought of our foundational speech, the Schuman Declaration of 9th of May 1950. It is to us something between the founding documents in the US for its importance and the Gettysburg Address for its historic impact with so much brevity. So super important for us. And I went back to Jean Monnet's memoir to see the backstage work of the Schuman Declaration, what was happening. This part of his life in his memoirs is described in a chapter with the title Deadlock, to give us an idea on how tense the situation was at the time. He wrote his memoirs in the 70s, and Jean Monnet says, it's difficult to remember writing today, in the 70s, or even more today, in 2022, how much the international situation seemed a deadlock at the time. War seemed inevitable, I quote him. How limited the scope was for any attempt to avoid a catastrophe. And I thought, I've heard that you already mentioned the idea of a volume 2 of the book with, in other conferences. There must be several speeches on the possibility of a war just 5 years after the end of the Second World War. The European Parliament owns Jean Monnet's house, which is in the countryside close to Paris. It's something like between Mount Vernon or Monticello for us and Camp David, because it's also a place for seminars, conference, retreat, and typically new civil servants to the European Parliament are invited to a retreat to be inspired by the place, his life, and his work. And these retreats or seminars always have a walk in the countryside, because we are told that Jean Monnet, to get his ideas, his clear vision, his highly creative, solution-oriented mind, he would go in the morning and walk for 1 hour in the countryside. So typically, we do this in retreats. And while reading the chapter on the deadlock, the situation in spring 1950, I saw that Jean Monnet, so walking in the countryside around Aujaret, his house, just didn't make it. I had to go to the Alps, like really much higher mountains, longer walks, to try and find a solution. And this is where he had this idea that we know is the substance of the Schuman Declaration. Then it was very interesting to see how this illustrates what you described and the different possibilities that events could take, how at one point history decides for one and another. So he had this idea in late April, and he thought, when can we get this out? There's this very important meeting on the 10th of May, 1950 in London, with Bevin and Dean Acheson. We have to speak before, which is why the Declaration Schuman was issued on the 9th of May. I know many people think it's 5 years and 1 day after the end of the Second World War in Europe. Not at all. The 10th of May meeting would have been a few weeks later. It might have been different. And so he knows what he wants to say. He knows when he wants to say. He thinks, he identifies that only France can say this message. I'm not saying this as a French. He explains that because of the historical situation, this was so. And I would just like to read the chapter he has about this in his memoirs. So once the text is ready, the essential elements were all in these 104 lines of text we now had, to which further days' work brought only minor modifications. In fact, it was all summed up in the following sentence. By the pooling of basic production and the establishment of a new high authority whose decision will be binding on France and Germany and the countries that would join them, this proposal will lay the first concrete foundations of the European Federation, which is indispensable to the maintenance of peace. And he adds, I ask for this passage in our text to be underlined because it described at one and the same time the method, the means, and the objective. The last word was the most important, peace. The same word that you identified as the common thread in your final chapter on the last words. And I was struck how they echo the situation today, actually today in October 2022. This very day, this very week, we mark the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And exactly 60 years ago, we still didn't know how it would unfold, which brought me back to the speech by Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also to how much history is in constant dialogue with events of the time and events of today. I mentioned this earlier. We have every year in the research service a launch of the year publication and event on 10 issues to watch in the year to come. And for 2022, one of the issues that was identified, I can see the speaker here, the researcher in the room, it was the nuclear non-proliferation and how much it resonates with what we have today. So this is so much in close dialogue with the chapter on the Kennedy's undelivered speech for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Jeff, may I ask you to read the last chapter, just the last chapter of, the last paragraph, paragraph of this chapter, and to tell us about the difference between the text as it is in the book and as it is in the audiobook that was read later.
Sure. And before I do that, hearing you talk about the sort of the hundreds or so lines that set this project in motion, it's another reminder of just the power of clarity and the power of brevity. You know, we think of extremely brief, concentrated communication as a result of Twitter or Instagram stories or Vine, back when Vine existed. But the first soundbite, right, goes back to 76 BC, right? Julius Caesar, you know, Veni Vidi Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Certainly, he had more to say about the sacking of the city of Zela. But if all you heard were those words, you got a pretty general sense of what had happened. And brevity is so powerful. And I think about this a lot as I write speeches, which is the way speeches have evolved. You know, early on, they were entertainment. People would pack a picnic and go listen to speeches for a couple hours. And then when I was working on the Obama campaign in 2008, this was really the rise of YouTube. And a speech would get cut up into pieces, and we'd put 3 or 4 minutes online. And so several 100,000 people would watch 3 or 4 minutes, and then 10 or 20,000 would click through and read the whole thing. So speeches were first as an entertainment, and then later on they became a vector, right? These video scripts became sort of a vector as a way to, if you were interested, you could dig deeper. And now speeches are almost rarely consumed as a whole. They're consumed in pieces. Yes, you write a whole speech, but this is the tweet, and this is the Instagram story, and this line goes into the annual report or the annual letter. This goes into the fundraising email. And so even though you want it all in one place, it's almost designed to be disassembled again. But the one thing that remains consistent is you want to, in a very clear and concise way, be able to state your vision or objective. In fact, when I write speeches, I will often write at the top my dream headline. If I could pay a reporter to write the perfect story about this speech or the event, what would the headline look like? And I keep that headline at the top of my page, because if at the end of the speech it doesn't lead me to that conclusion, then I've somehow made a mistake. Now, to your question about this chapter, about nuclear proliferation and an anniversary we recognize today, this chapter, I say, contains the most terrifying parenthetical in world history. So Kennedy, when he was deciding the course of action in Cuba in response to the buildup of Soviet missiles, his brother, Robert Kennedy, divided his advisors into 2 groups. And these groups, they named them. This became the first use in history of the terms hawks and doves. The groups were called the War Hawks and the Picasso Doves. And the War Hawks were in favor of airstrikes. The Doves were in favor of a blockade. And the idea that Robert Kennedy said is, before you present your recommendations to the president, the first thing in your dossier needs to be a speech. And the idea was the president needs to hear what it would sound like to announce this course of action to the American people. And so therefore, almost if you couldn't visualize it, or you couldn't hear it, if it didn't make sense as an argument, maybe it wasn't the right course of action. But in this speech, and I have it in the book, there's a page where he's describing the airstrikes, and then he puts a parentheses, right? And in speeches, we often put parentheses to say, I'll fill that in later. And this parentheses says, hold for description of first reports of action. Basically, he's saying, we're going to launch these airstrikes, and then we'll finish the speech by describing what happened afterwards. Of course, what we now know is what would have happened afterwards, potentially, was a nuclear counterstrike. And so I say, there's a saying that, that on your tombstone, there's the year you were born and the year that you die, and a little dash in between. And there's a saying that to God, that tiny dash is everything. Well, I say in the book, in the speech, to humanity, that parentheses could have been everything. So it's a very powerful moment, the anniversary today. However, when I wrote the book, in the last chapter, in the end of the chapter, I write, but what we do know today is that as more nations pursue nuclear weapons and dictators like North Korea's Kim Jong-un show a willingness to engage in nuclear brinksmanship, the debates Kennedy's advisors had, the outcomes they envisioned, the words they planned to speak, the unknown words that would have filled the most consequential of parentheses, do more than illustrate a harrowing path not taken. They shed light on a path we may again have to travel. And so the very last edit I made in the book, it didn't make it in time for this edition, but the very last edit I made in the audiobook is, what do you think? I said, and dictators like North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Russia's Vladimir Putin, right? So even as the book was coming out, this path not taken continued to shed light on new paths that we may yet have to travel.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity to remind what speeches can achieve. Just words can achieve things as historically important as peace. With this, I will come back to my initial question. Why are we here in the room? Why I had this idea 1 year ago that it could be useful for us to hear this. The beauty of being on stage in front of the audience and not online in front of your screen is that I could read your faces while you were listening to Jeff earlier or while he answered my questions. And I could see on how attentive you were that indeed this was probably very useful for colleagues, speakers, speechwriters who are in this room, which is why, and I bring my thank at the very end of what I will say, I would like to thank Etienne for the constant support to Speaking with Impact and to the management for supporting the idea of this book talk on Jeff's book. And with this, I close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabelle and Jeff for this conversation. I think it was fascinating. I was just thinking about the Schuman Declaration. And I think at the time they didn't want to have so much impact because it was so enormous in terms of the change that were coming to the continent, putting under the same authority coal and steel that were the means for war, that they were actually understated in the way they promoted the declaration. The declaration was done and it was just filmed, I think, the day after because they didn't had a media plan. But maybe it was better like that because if it had been promoted too much, then it could have had counteracting from some that were against that project that changed so much the continent. So then we have about a bit more than 20 minutes for questions. And I would like to ask if there are any in the room. I have a couple, but I keep them in case there is no one in the room, but I'm sure there will be. Please raise your hand. That's the first thing to do. And then you will be helped with a microphone. And of course, say very briefly who you are to help Jeff and maybe me and Isabelle to know with whom they are talking. Over to you, Magdalena.
Thank you. Yes, I am Magdalena. I am a member of the community of practice led by Isabelle. I've read excellent reviews of your book in the internet, so congratulations. I have a very practical question. I mean, I would like to know, how do you work in practice preparing a speech? How much time does it take? Do you sit down and work for 4 or 5 hours in a row, or you make breaks, or you go for a walk, or, you know, your practicalities of your work? And another question is, when you're preparing a speech with someone else who is going to deliver the speech, how much time does it take to prepare a good speech, a good delivery? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And before I answer that, I will say, because we were talking about concise and sound bites, the Research Service has put together a wonderful exhibit on the speeches that made Europe. And I was so struck by the Mitterrand speech, nationalism is war, right? Le nationalisme, c'est la guerre. Like, you could imagine a process where he's making an argument. Why is nationalism dangerous? Why is it bad? Why do we want transnational institutions, right? But that summation is so clear and so powerful. And that's really, the power of a concise argument. So just finishing that thought and recommending this wonderful exhibit that's coming together. So yeah, how do you do the job? How do you do the job? And there's no exact single answer, but when I am asked by someone to help them with a speech, it first starts with a lot of research. I want to read everything they've written, listen to them interviewed, get videos, because one thing when you write for someone, they will often say, well, how do you make it sound like me? How do you make it sound like me? And you can listen and you can understand their patterns of speech and what words they like and what stories they like to tell. But that often doesn't do the full job. Because the other thing I try to do is I try to understand, how do they make an argument? How do they see the world? Because honestly, when someone says, I want to hire you, I want you to help me write a speech, how do you make it sound like me? I want to say, well, if you want it to sound like you already sound like you. So you don't really want to sound like you. You want to sound like a better version of you. And so I think about, how does it think like me? And so I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how someone thinks and how they make an argument. So that's part of it on the substance. There's also, we haven't talked much about, we've talked about pathos, emotion, and story. We haven't really talked about ethos, which is characterization. Because the other thing I do is I read about the person, I interview. Once I've read everything, I interview them, I ask them tough questions. I really try to get them speaking freely, because I say, you'll talk freely to me, but don't worry, you own this. You won't have to share everything you've shared with me, but I want to get a broader sense. But ethos is also characterization. It's say, okay, so I've learned about you, but let me try to learn something about the audience. How are you going to connect to this audience? Where is the place where you will make that audience say, oh, they understand me? And so I also do a lot of research on the audience. Has the speaker met members of the audience before? Are there stories that generate from that? Are there metaphors you can pull from the room? I wrote a speech for a client in Israel, and they were speaking at a university on a hilltop, and I said, describe the room to me. And they said, it's a glass rectangle, and one side you look out and you see the desert, and the other side you look down kind of the valley to the seacoast, and it's very green. And that became the speech metaphor. It said, what turns the desert that we see out this window into the prosperous valley we see here? It's not irrigation, it's education, right? And that makes people think, oh, wow, that's really smart. They thought of it just there. But it's research. It's something a speechwriter helps someone do. And so a little bit on how they think, a little bit on how to connect them to the audience, and then you sit down and write. And the writing, and I can talk about this for hours. I will not take hours to answer this, but persuasive speeches, all persuasive speeches really include 5 basic steps. And this is my writer's block cure. I write down five bullet points, and I try to fill in each one. Attention, how am I going to get attention? What's the story, the joke, the bold? If people watch TED Talks, anyone watched a TED Talk before? Anyone see a TED Talk? Right? TED Talks always start with one of 3 things: a story, a joke, or a bold or counterintuitive claim. Right? Every TED Talk. If you just watch me for the next 18 minutes, I'll add 3 years to your life. And you go, oh, how do I do that? And right, so you're paying attention. So attention, problem, What problem am I trying to solve? Solution. What's my solution? And then an important step people forget is visualization. In other words, it's not enough to show you can solve a problem, right? Many of us are technocrats. We believe in evidence. We believe in good policy. But that's solving an intellectual exercise. The vision is, what does the world look like once I've solved this problem? Because it's not enough to show you can solve a problem. You need to show people how their lives are going to get better. And I have lots of clients, that make technology. And in the technology space, they say, describe the benefits, not the features, right? Apple doesn't tell you about, interestingly, Samsung does, but Apple doesn't tell you about the megapixels on the camera. They just show how now you can take photos of your friends at night, and they look beautiful, right? One is a feature, one is a benefit. So the vision is you can take pictures anywhere. The feature is the technology. So attention, problem, solution, visualization, and then call to action. If you're excited about this vision, here's how you can help make it a reality. So that's really my writer's block. And then how many hours does it take? It can vary widely. I mean, when I had a company and we wrote a lot of speeches and we got paid for it, we sort of had an estimate that you should give yourself like 40 hours to write like a keynote speech, interviews and everything. That's a lot, but it can, 40. But when you work in government, when I worked in Congress, they would often say, hey, the senator's going to the floor in 40 minutes, So somewhere between 40 hours and 40 minutes. How's that for an answer?
Thank you, Jeff. To complement and answer Magdalena's question on how to capture the voice, how to speak, how to write like the speaker. From my experience, there are two approaches to this. It really complements what you said. Some try to capture the voice of the speaker. So they would take a lot of notes when the speaker speaks. They use these words, they have this type of sentences, really to try to really record the voice and be as close as possible to the voice of the speaker. That's one way. On the opposite, it's this thing, if you write super clearly, if you articulate the reasoning, if it's really intelligent, smart, you give the speech, they say, that's my voice. So actually both ways lead to this. I would add one thing, I don't know for you, Jeff, but something I've heard a lot among colleagues at international level. It is like Jean Monnet, we go for walks. And very often walking helps to articulate the thinking. I don't know if you practice this or another one to help.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes. I mean, I do try to clear my head. I'll go for runs or walks or bike rides. But yes, I tend to. There does take a moment where you have to take a step back and you have to say, what is this? And by the way, the other thing I do is I read aloud everything I've written. I think aloud. In fact, my editor for this book said, oh, this is written very well, but it sounds too conversational. And I said, good, don't change a word. Like, I hear speeches, not conversations, and it's a good reminder that a speech is not an essay, it's sheet music. I think you've asked me, others have asked me, what are the great European speeches? And I think of, Václav Havel, who was a poet. And when he speaks, you're hearing poetry. You're not hearing an essay. And so the other thing that happens when you read a speech aloud, first of all, you say, at some point, if you're reading it aloud, you think, I'm getting bored. And if you're reading your own speech and you're getting bored, you can be sure the audience is getting bored. So the minute I start getting bored, I start cutting. I say, like, this is when the speechwriter becomes a surgeon, and a chance to cut is a chance to cure. So when you read a speech aloud, you find many extraneous words, you find many difficult words, and you find many complicated sentences that don't need to be complicated. In America, the average person comprehends language at about the age of an 11-year-old. Now, that doesn't mean they can't understand complicated ideas, but it means many people get up to speak and they say, now I am speaking and I will orate, and I will show you how smart I am, and I will sound fancy. And that actually doesn't help. Simple language to convey complicated ideas. And actually, if you don't mind, I'll share one more example of this. A psychologist did a presentation and asked the audience in America, draw a picture of a swamp. And everyone could draw a swamp, alligators, snakes, turtles, some water. Now draw a picture of greater ethics and integrity. and no one could draw what ethics or integrity looked like. They said, now draw a picture of a wall. A wall. Everyone can draw a wall, some bricks. Now draw a picture of humane but enhanced border security. Right? No one could draw it. And of course, you understand where this is going. One was what Donald Trump was saying, and one was what Hillary Clinton was saying. And they're similar concepts, and he, of course, was, being combative. But it's a reminder that the simpler and more understandable and more relevant and real you can make your policies, the more likely people are to be able to grab on them and understand them.
Thank you for that. Imagine, Jeff, how difficult it is in a multicultural environment where members of parliament use 24 languages, are allowed to use 24 languages talking in plenary to each other. I see a question in the back there. Can you introduce yourself and put your question, please?
Hello, great to speak to you, great to meet you. We shared a former boss. My first job in politics was working for Joe Biden on the presidential campaign, but here I am at last. So actually my question was just following up on that. You talk about speaking simple language and how we can use simple language. Of course, there are many languages in the European Union. Do you have a piece of advice for leaders trying to communicate with people across linguistic and cultural divides?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm glad to see a fellow survivor of the Joe Biden experience. I have more questions for you afterwards. But it is tricky when you're writing with the understanding of translation. And the real challenge is, without thinking, we speak in so many idioms, right? We speak in cultural references. Even if you look at the talk I brought here, at the last minute, I'm crossing out words and turns of phrase, and I even made sure to test the joke to see if the joke would translate, because so many jokes rest on plays of language. And so really, I think first is you think of your listeners in mind, and have I said something that is hyper-specific to one culture or community or language? But the other thing is, people are very shy to focus group and show a speech before it gets delivered, right? People always want to hold on to it. I believe the opposite. I believe practice it out loud, show it to people, see if, because I'm always surprised that a lot of people, you show a speech to someone and it's like a consultant, right? No one hires a consultant and the consultant comes in and says it's perfect, right? No consultant ever says it's perfect, because then they don't earn their paycheck. So you show a speech to someone, they're never going to tell you it's perfect, and you'll ignore a lot of what they say. But often they will flag something that says, I don't understand this doesn't quite work right. So I'm always in favor of sharing something. And I'll give you an example from the world of comedy. One of my jobs in America, we have a humor award called the Mark Twain Prize. And all these comedians come together and pay tribute to another comedian. And I got to work with them and watch all these comedians practice their routines. And these are famous people, Seth Meyers, Tina Fey. And they would stand up, and their routine would be on the teleprompter. And they would say, okay, in practice. So there's not a lot of people in the room, but there's some. So they'd just say, scroll the teleprompter. And they go, yep, okay, yep, great. Because they didn't want anyone to hear what they were going to say. And then Steve Martin walked in. And you know Steve Martin, the comedian, the actor? He walks in, and he practices his routine out loud. And he works on each joke until he can hear the janitor laughing or the person building the stage. You know, there may be 12 people in the room, but he's trying to hear if he gets it right. And so he didn't want to hide his material. He wanted to see if it would work, and he changed it in real time. And I thought that was a wonderful lesson, which is that he was sort of the grandfather, but he was the most confident that the greater risk wasn't that someone would see my material. The greater risk was that I would hold on to my material, and then it wouldn't work.
Isabelle?
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you very much for asking this question. It happens that I've been fighting with this for more than a decade. So, because it's so important for us in Brussels, in the European institution, if we can convey our message, explain our policies throughout the 27 member states. So I would like to complement this even more, the importance and power of stories, because stories resonate in whatever language they are told, and of concrete, tangible words, visualization. With abstract words, you might lose your audience and it might not work when being translated in different languages, but stories and visual, concrete languages really help us. And I think it's important, whichever institution we work in, that we become better and better at this.
And if I could add, analogies work as well. Analogies tend to work across languages and cultures. When I was working in the United States Congress, there was a tax cut proposal. And the analysis was that if you were a millionaire, the tax cut would give you about $60,000. And if you were a low-wage worker, you would get about $45. And so we thought, well, how do we show this to people? How do we explain this to people? And so we decided to have an event where we pulled up onto the lawn of the Capitol a brand new $65,000 Lexus. And then on a small table, we put the muffler, the piece of the Lexus that you could get. And so you don't really need, right, across every language, you understand if you're rich, you get this, and if you're poor, you get that, right? And so analogies tend to work very nicely as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question to you, Jeff.
Please.
You mentioned earlier the speech of Mitterrand on war and le nationalisme, c'est la guerre, and sadly we have again war on the continent. And I wanted to hear from you, how do you see the situation and especially the importance of the speeches in the early phase of the war in Ukraine that was launched by Russia, and the speeches of, if you can comment on this, of President Zelensky that have been mobilizing his opinion, but also much beyond the wider world, how you assess this and how it might also have turned some of the opinions in some countries.
I thank you for that question, because this actually gets to something, Isabelle, you were discussing as well, which is, okay, can speeches really help? Can they really help? And one of the things I think most people would concede is when Russia invaded, Ukraine was a little bit of a question mark. And Zelensky was a little bit of a question mark. Would Ukraine fold? Would Zelensky rise to the occasion? In the US, all we knew of Zelensky was he was this person who had been sort of bullied by Donald Trump. And then all of a sudden he begins speaking, and he speaks in a very different and powerful way, right? The early speech is sometimes just handheld to a camera, right? I'm here, we are here, simple language, powerful language, rallying language. And then he begins speaking via satellite to parliaments all over the world. And there's a bit of a formula to these speeches. He identifies the most painful chapter in every nation's history where he's speaking, and to this point of analogy. And he basically says, this is what is happening in our nation right now, right? We talked about Verdun a little bit when he spoke. You know, he basically identified, and in the most powerful terms, became a combination of, here, I'll use another US example, right? We had a President, Ronald Reagan, who was an actor. Right, the UK had Winston Churchill, who was sort of a bulldog, a rallier. And he became a little bit of a Churchill-Reagan combination. He had the natural poise and stage presence of the actor that he was, but he was rallying people to fight something existential. And I don't agree with all of the Churchill analogies, but there's a little bit of that because he was framing things in existential terms and framing them accurately. So I think he's doing a couple of things that are very powerful. But I do think that his words had a galvanizing effect, not just on the Ukrainian people, but a galvanizing effect on the democratic world. I mean, that was the moment people said around the world and in parliaments around the world, oh, this is an effort we need to support.
Thank you. One more question, if there is one in the room. Yes, please. Giulio.
Thank you. I'm Giulio. I'm working for the database office. We met already.
Yes, yeah.
Well, of course,
Giulio, get closer with the mic.
Yeah, can you hear me? I will bring a lot of things out of this presentation. Fact-checking, stories. You are more authentic when you rehearse. The question is more related to statistics. Of course, you use it for fact-checking, but how do you use it in speeching? How much? What is the simple way?
Yeah, this is I love this question. Yeah, because data visualization is so important. And there's all these famous quotes. Statistics are people with the tears wiped off. Statistics don't bleed. It is the mark of an intelligent person to be able to be moved by statistics. Lots of writers wrestle with how do you use statistics. And I've come to an approach, and the problem, of course, is that people tend not to know the difference between a trillion, a billion, and a million, right? It's hard to get people to wrap their minds around statistics. And so I use a technique that I call social math, which is how can I make this statistic real in somebody's life? So like the tax plan, a Lexus or a muffler. But people have done this very effectively all the time. When President Kennedy talked to the American people about how much it would cost to go to the moon, he said less than Americans spend on chewing gum every year, right? So it's an analogy. When I was working for President Clinton, he was going to do a volunteer effort where they were going to paint a room in a school, right? And we call this a photo op. They were just going to go and paint a room, but they weren't really going to change anything. And President Clinton said, well, this looks kind of silly. I'm just going to paint one wall and leave. How can I make this meaningful to people? And so I went to all of our researchers and I said, okay, how many people in the United States have the last name Clinton? And how many schoolrooms are there in the United States? And I went to our Department of Labor was actually able to tell me how long it takes to paint a wall. And so I took all of these statistics, and Bill Clinton was able to say, okay, I'm just painting one wall, and I know that's a photo op. But if everyone with just my last name gave 1 hour a week, we could repaint every wall in every schoolroom in every school in the United States. So I took this one thing and using statistics, help people understand their part in a larger solution. And by the way, when Bill Gates talked about fighting malaria, he said, and this answer will feel relevant to you and me, he said, we spend less on drugs to fight malaria than we spend on drugs to fight baldness. And he said, look, I understand baldness is a very important challenge. And he said, look, it's very important to Steve Ballmer. But he said, we fight baldness because it affects men, and generally, and rich men. And so he didn't use the dollar figure, he used the idea. And so I'm always trying to find a balance between the power of the number itself, but helping people understand what the number means in ways that they can wrap their arms around.
Thank you. A quick comment, Isabelle?
Thank you. Yes, Giulio, to give you an example, I think one of the best answer on this question, what to do with statistics, were words pronounced in the European Parliament. And I always give this example when I'm asked. We have a Human Rights Prize, the Sakharov Prize, awarded by the European Parliament. And in 2017, it went to the opposition in Venezuela. And when they came to the plenary in Strasbourg to receive the prize, the leader of the opposition wanted to speak about the inflation, 2,000% in Venezuela, what does it mean, 2,000%? And he immediately translated, which means that last year, almost everyone lost 10 kilos in Venezuela. 10 kilos lost in 1 year. And then we can see what it means on the face, on the belt that you need. So, Giulio, this kind of pictures, and Giulio, and it happens, I know well Giulio, and colleagues, when we write, when we communicate about our policies, to make it so tangible, it's a European example to illustrate exactly the same.
Thank you very much for these powerful examples. And actually, Giulio is the head of our statistical office in the EPRS, and he knows very well how we can project a bigger picture with a very simple figure. Often the European Union is challenged how much it costs, and in fact it costs a couple of euros per citizen if we look at the cost of the institutions, and there is a way to compare with a cup of coffee, a €1 coin, and so on and so on. And I think we have also to do this type of work because we need to explain such figures in a simple way that can be understood by everyone. We could go on for hours. It's 3 o'clock now. It has been a wonderful conversation. Many thanks, Jeff. Many thanks, Isabelle. I understand that after this, you will be available for staying a couple of minutes in the room so that if people have further questions, they can come to you. Many thanks to the audience here for staying this afternoon here, for being back in this great library reading room. And many thanks also to the ones that are behind the screens, watching at the camera on web stream. That's great to have you here. This is not the end also for those who missed it or you want to re-listen it, because it's all stored and will be broadcasted on YouTube in a couple of days. And to finish, I'd just like to mention again the project that we have on speeches that made Europe, that Isabelle is so successfully organizing with the colleagues of communications in the EPRS. It's about speeches from public figures, intellectuals, historians, and it shows, if you go there and you listen to them, either the smaller version or the longer speeches, how much these speeches have been important in the European Union, being Louis Weiss, François Mitterrand, but also more recently Greta Thunberg, when she challenges Europe with on climate action. So go there, and if you are interested in American politics, let's go back to this. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we have an online roundtable on the midterm election that's going to be extremely interesting. So I encourage you to go online. This is not going to be in presence this time. Thanks a lot again to both of you and to the room, and have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.